Israel, rightly, is the focus of the Middle East. But the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine are having a massive impact on another country, one that is at a real risk of completely falling apart, and one that we don't hear a massive about in the news today. But the collapse or political turmoil in this country has global implications. That country is Egypt. Mihailo Zekic has an article on Egypt's situation in our latest Trumpet print magazine, and he's here with me now to talk about that article. Thanks for joining us, Mihailo. How bad is it?
I don't want to be hyperbolic, but with the state of the Egyptian economy, not just this year, but for the past several years, I honestly would not be surprised if we had a revolution sometimes within the next 12 months. In April, the International Monetary Fund estimated that Egypt's inflation rate, just with its currency itself, is about 32.5%. That's the ninth highest in the world. And for some perspective, that's higher than some other notorious trouble spots like Haiti or Bangladesh. It's the second largest debtor nation to the International Monetary Fund. And this is obviously having massive ripple effects in this country that's over 110 million people, most of which are clustered around the Nile Delta. Most of this country is not capable of sustaining food or urban development. It's obviously in the middle of the desert. And because of problems like the currency that we were talking about, and a host of other issues that you alluded to, which we'll talk about a little bit later, people are starting to feel the pinch in Egypt. This is what Vivian Yi, the New York Times Cairo bureau chief, said in January last year. Quote, "Grocery prices are stratospheric. Money is worth half of what it was a year ago. For many, eggs are now a luxury and meat is off the table. For others, burdened with school fees and medical expenses, the middle-class lives they have worked doggedly to sustain are slipping beyond their grasp." End quote. And this is, again, from her perspective, that she was writing January of last year. And these trends that she was talking about haven't gotten any better and certainly have gotten worse. Things are pretty serious in Egypt right now.
So maybe let's start with food. I mean, you're a historian as well. I mean, so this plays a huge role in so many revolutions. You know, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. Food is so often a kind of an immediate catalyst there. I think in your article you talked about 1 in 5 Egyptian children have stunted growth due to undernourishment. I mean, that's not just people complain. I mean, inflation, things like that, they hurt anyway. But that is a sobering statistic about just how bad one of these most basic needs is becoming in Egypt.
Yes, and it has been actually bad for quite a long time because of statistics like that, because of poverty rates. Egypt has had a bread subsidiary program for going back all the way to when it was a British protectorate. And every time an Egyptian leader's tried to get rid of it, there's been mass riots. But they've had good reason to get rid of it because it costs like 2% of the country's GDP just subsidizing people's bread. Wheat and grain products especially is an important part of the functioning of the Egyptian economy, of functioning of society in and of itself. And you alluded to the Ukraine war. This has had dramatic effects on Egypt, especially. Egypt constantly is ping-ponging with China to get the #1 spot of the world's biggest wheat importer because of the bread subsidy program.
And China's 10 times the population.
Yes, exactly. And China obviously has a lot more land to grow food with. Egypt's in the middle of the desert. It has the Nile River. The Nile River has been able to sustain civilizations for millennia, but not of 110 million people. Russia, meanwhile, is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's 5th or 6th. When the war started, all that supply lines got immediately disrupted. There has been a little bit of, I guess you could say, mending of the ties since then. But one of the things Russia especially has tried to do is to try and leverage cutting off these exports, both theirs and Ukraine's, with the infamous Black Sea targetings, to try and get some of these third world countries like Egypt more on their side, more pressuring the rest of the international community to get the West to back off, to take sanctions off Russia. Egypt is feeling the pinch, and this is, in a sense, it's deliberate and man-made for countries just like Egypt. Again, as I mentioned, some of This has been remedied. Ukraine has been relying on like sending wheat through NATO waters to get things done. But for a country in Egypt's situation, even just a minor, it's not a minor, even like a shock like that momentarily for the system, that's going to have massive reverberations throughout the economy.
So the subsidized bread program, I think you wrote that 70% of the population are on this subsidized bread. They put the prices up fourfold in June. And by subsidized bread, this is very subsidized bread. I think it used to be 1/10 of a cent per loaf. And these are smaller loaves. They're not, it's kind of more like, say, a roti bread than a big Western style loaf. But still, 1/10 of a cent. It's gone up to more like 0.4 of a cent, about half a cent a loaf. So heavily subsidized. And so this is where, okay, there's all these food shocks that have hit, but it means that so many other things hit bread and food because of 2% of the government's expenditure going to food. And the fact that Egypt needs then foreign currency to buy this food from other places. And Egypt doesn't make a lot that they export. They don't have a very diverse way of getting their hands on foreign currency that they need to buy food. Instead, it's just a couple of key sources that have also been hit. And so perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of those. I guess tourism being probably the big one. Like I remember 10 years ago, I would hear about people going on holiday to Egypt. I don't anymore. I mean, that's but as you listen to this, like all of this directly impacts food because the government is using the money that it gets from tourism and these other situations to buy food to feed its own people. So this is, I think, much more socially significant than when you have currency problems and economic difficulties in a lot of other countries, because Egypt is dependent on these to meet the most basic needs of its population.
Exactly. You mentioned tourism. Tourism comprises roughly 15% of Egypt's GDP. 15% is basically met by just people coming from abroad and spending money on hotels and whatnot to go visit the pyramids. And there's obviously been a lot of other crises to impact tourism, not just the Ukraine war. A third of Russia's tourists actually came from Russia and Ukraine, and then that obviously...
A third of Egypt's tourists.
Or Egypt's tourists, pardon me. But you also had crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course famously shut down global travel. For a lot of us in the West, maybe we were itching on our seats. Oh, that means we can't go and vacation on the beach in Spain anymore. As far as Egypt was concerned, that was basically drying up one of their key pillars of their economy. Prior to COVID, Egypt just met a record max of 13 million tourists in 2019 going to visit. And that dropped to 3.6 tourists going into the 2020 fiscal year. The 2021 fiscal year plunged its revenue of tourism nearly 70%. And again, COVID's over at this point. It's been over for a little bit. Tourism is starting to pick back up, but it's not like what it was as you were talking about, that Egypt is like the go-to place for a lot of people. And again, with such a country that already has a poverty problem like Egypt, that has all these other problems hitting it, like even with the momentary pause, that's going to eat up people's savings, like whatever they had left. That's going to take a lot of time to make back up. And especially with the inflation I was talking about, when they do make it up, it's not going to be worth much anyway.
And it can easily become a vicious cycle where, like, okay, Egypt is poorer, so it's less safe, so people feel less comfortable going there on holiday. So it becomes poorer and less safe, and it can kind of spiral downhill. And then to complete this perfect storm, though, we have the Gaza war, and then some of the way, okay, that makes the general region less appealing as a holiday destination, but there's much more direct effects for Egypt.
Yes, well, the Gaza war has been interesting because Egypt's been one of the few countries that has been able to speak both with Israel and Hamas. So they've actually been getting a little bit of foreign support that way. But the main reason that people are sending money to keep the mediation going is because they see how bad the economy is with Egypt, including especially in a major way with the Gaza war. And that revolves around the Houthi extremist group in Yemen. As I'm sure most of our viewers would know, last November, they joined in the war with Hamas. Like Hamas are an Iranian proxy, and they started targeting Western shipping going through the southern exit point of the Red Sea that was meant to hurt Israeli trade going to, or the port in Eilat there on Israel's coast in the Gulf of Aqaba. Israel does not depend on the Red Sea and that maritime corridor nearly as much as Egypt does.
Because everyone's paying money to Egypt to use it.
Yeah, everyone's paying money to Egypt to use the Suez Canal.
And it's a massive, like, it's really expensive to take a big boat through the Suez.
Yeah, so obviously not targeting the Suez Canal itself, but if you target the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, I mean, you need both points of the Red Sea to use it, and if one side gets out of commission, then the Suez Canal is basically worthless. And you mentioned costs. In January, just this past January, just a couple months after the Houthis started their campaign, the Suez Canal Authority reported that they had lost about 40% of the revenue they had that time last year, which, I mean, again, just in 2 months, that's a massive hit to the economy. And obviously the Houthis to this day are still targeting the Red Sea shipping. I think the initial shock has worn a little bit down, but it's still a threat. People are still avoiding that corridor. And as long as the war keeps going on, Egypt is still going to feel that pinch.
And this to me is where this story just gets insane. Like, okay, Egypt is facing this perfect storm of crises where all of these different events going on for very different reasons, kind of completely unconnected, like the Ukraine war, the Gaza war. They're all combining to cause this perfect storm for Egypt. And, okay, well, what do you do if your family is facing bankruptcy, you can't afford meat, you're struggling to put food on the table, you don't know how you're going to pay your bills tomorrow? You don't decide that now is the perfect time to put in a brand new kitchen with state-of-the-art appliances and granite countertops and a 4K TV in your kit. Like, but that is exactly what Egypt is doing right now.
Exactly. We're going to play a slightly spiced clip now that the Wall Street Journal put together of Egypt's probably most notorious spending project.
Sitting over 20 miles east of the current capital in Cairo, Egypt is building a new administrative capital from the ground up. The nearly $58 billion plan includes a miles-long Central Park, a main business district with a Chinese-built tower, and massive new headquarters for the Egyptian Ministry of Defense, known as the Octagon. But some say
it's a city for 6 million people, and I don't think there are 6 million people that can actually afford this city.
That was referring to what the Egyptian government is calling the new administrative capital. They plan on giving it a new name sometime soon.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that, and I thought NAC was a terrible name for a capital.
Yeah, they've been saying they've wanted to get a new name for a while, and they haven't actually done it, so I don't know what they're dragging their feet for. But as you can see from the video, it's further to the east from Cairo. It's basically a brand new city in the middle of the Sahara Desert. The official excuse of why they're building this is Cairo has 22 million people. It's congested. It's like not the cleanest place to have an efficient, functioning, running government. A lot of people think that it's more for Sisi trying to get out of Cairo's potentially unruly population in case if there's another revolt like we saw in 2011. He could be outside of the fray and handle it better. But with spending priorities like that, with phase one in and of itself costing $58 billion, like, which was an increase of what they were expecting to pay for it, for things like the world's largest defense ministry. I guess the Pentagon was too small for Sisi, so he had to go a couple of degrees bigger. Like,
yeah, it's an octagon.
Yeah, it's an octagon.
It's bigger and better than the Pentagon because it's got 8 sides.
Yes, like the average Egyptian looking at that, like, I think they all know on the street what this is really about for. Like the New York Times, I remember in an article they wrote about this, they asked one of the construction workers about this, and he just said, yeah, none of this is for us. And then he looked at a billboard of Sisi and said, it's for him. Like, and other like grandiose aspects of the city, like the world's largest cathedral in the Middle East, when like the Coptic Orthodox Church already has a cathedral in Cairo, like the largest skyscraper in Africa, like it's
Africa's second largest mosque.
Yeah, it's basically one big vanity project, and it's not the only one. They're also building outside the pyramids, the Grand Egyptian Museum. It's costing about $1 billion to build. It's going to be the largest archaeological museum when finished. The Sisi even oversaw construction of the world's largest suspension bridge. It's And granted, some of these are like projects that say started under Mubarak, and now the view is like we've made it this far, might as well finish it. And this kind of investment, obviously, like, if that museum is going to help with the tourist industry and whatnot. But at the same time, like, there are a lot of easier ways to jumpstart the economy, even with infrastructure projects and these grandiose visions. And even some of the projects that they've been trying to do to jumpstart the economy, like an expansion of the Suez Canal, that actually hasn't, like, even before the Houthis have been attacking, that actually hasn't been giving the revenue they were hoping it would be giving. So Egypt is spending basically like drunken sailors to get this going. And again, the people know what this is all about. This is like in 2019, there was an incident where where a huge crowd of people were protesting Sisi in constructing a bunch of palaces for himself. And after thousands were incarcerated, he told media, and I quote, "So what if I have palaces?" And then you contrast that with this second clip we'll play. Unfortunately, it's in Arabic, but there's subtitles.
If the price of progress and prosperity for the nation is that it does not eat or drink like others do, then we will not eat or drink.
And by we, he means all those millions of people in Cairo we were talking about. And I don't know how he summarizes like prosperity with not eating and drinking. I guess it might be a let them eat cake moment that he had. But again, Egyptians know that this is not about fundamentally jumpstarting the economy. He's basically, you mentioned the Russian Revolution, he's basically turning Egypt into his own personal czarist playground for all intents and purposes.
He saw, like, Egypt's leader, Mubarak, getting overthrown is not ancient history. Like, he was on the scene. He saw that happen. I guess, does he believe that he's just got enough control of the army that it doesn't matter what people think? Or has he just lost it at this point? Like, it just, this whole side of the story seems utterly bizarre to me. I mean, I admittedly, I am not an expert on Sisi. I've not really studied his biography that much, but he never really struck me as a megalomaniac.
Only Sisi knows what Sisi's thinking, but at the same time, I think he knows in the back of his head that Egypt geopolitically is a bit too big to fail for a lot of countries in the world. So, like I mentioned, the International Monetary Fund, every now and then you'll hear him again going for another loan, and they'll give it to him usually with no strings attached, or at least with minimal strings attached. Israel, of course, Sisi's arguably Israel's best friend in the Arab world. They can't afford to let him leave. He's also really close with Russia, as I mentioned. He has ties with the United States. I think he's banking, no pun intended, on if things were to go south, then the international community is going to be there for him to keep him propped up, because they saw what happened with Mubarak, and much of the rest of the world doesn't want a repeat of that.
That makes sense. So I guess that's his calculus. We're expecting something very different, and that is because of, and this is something that is so easy to read and very specific, directly out of the Bible, where you can just read a verse or two and see where the Bible tells you this is going to turn around.
And that particular verse or passage of verses would be in Daniel 11. Verse 40 talks about an end-time clash between a king of the north and a king of the south. We've talked many times in this program before about the king of the north being a uniting European power and the king of the south being a radical Islamist power led by Iran, and that the king of the north comes in to deal with this rising Islamist bloc forming. Iran's going to be the leader of this bloc, but it's not going to be the only country in that bloc. And if you keep reading further, especially verses 42 and 43, it talks about the land of Egypt not escaping from the king of the north's path. Verse 43 mentions that the king of the north will have power over all the gold and silver and the precious things of Egypt, implying that Egypt is allied with the king of the south. And interestingly enough, in those sections of verses, Egypt is actually mentioned more often than the actual king of the south is. And it's the one mentioned with all like the gold and the wealth, and Egypt's obviously in a shaky position right now, but it's still a powerful country. It still has an amazingly powerful military. The military has been running the country for decades. It still has an amazing geography. And it looks like that does not leave the king of the north notices that. Regards to where this plays with Iran, etc., the implication is that somehow Egypt gets into Iran's orbit. That's very, very unlikely with the current administration. Anything's possible. But what we're watching mainly for is a type of revolution like we saw in 2011, like we saw that ousted Mubarak and brought in the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, this group that wants a reset with Iran, that wants to get behind Iran's vision. Right now, the Muslim Brotherhood isn't particularly popular in Egypt, but I mean, with all the circumstances going on right now, I mean, the Bolsheviks weren't popular in Russia leading up to the revolution. The people weren't revolting because of communism. Like you said, they're revolting because they didn't have bread.
And then the Bolsheviks were the best organized and most ruthless of quite a few different groups that were able to take advantage of that. And then you could easily see the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by Iran, falling into exactly the same category.
That's what they did in 2011. And I mean, like you said, you could easily see that this doing right now. And as I mentioned at the start, with all these crises hitting Egypt, and I'm a little bit amazed more people aren't talking about it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised within the next 12 months we do get a revolution there. And of course, even if there is a revolution there, everybody, I mean, thought that, Egypt might finally become a liberal democracy in 2011. That's not what happened. But even if there is a revolution forming, we can't really know what the outcome is just by looking at the facts on the ground. That's where the Bible prophecy comes in. And that's why we watch Egypt, because it's the Bible, because the book of Daniel says Egypt is important. And even, this is not just like one other country in the Middle East having another regime change. This is not like something that's going to be yesterday's news pretty fast. Egypt, as I mentioned, has a huge military. If it becomes Islamist, it's going to change the security factor in Israel in a dramatic way. Our editor-in-chief, Mr. Joe Fleury, has talked about once Egypt falls, you could see a lot of other countries in Africa falling to radical Islam. This is not just a localized issue. This is going to impact the whole world.
Right. This is a very big deal. Now, Egypt, Daniel 11, it tells us that the king of the north is going to come and it's going to attack the king of the south. It will conquer the king of the south and Egypt. And so, as you said, the implication of that is that Egypt is allied with the king of the south. And as we've said, since certainly the mid-90s, the early 90s, radical Islam led by Iran is this king of the south. And we have a whole booklet, the King of the South booklet, that goes through and explains exactly why we say that. But Daniel 11 says specifically that this is a clash that will happen at the time of the end. And it's a clash that this makes it clear, this passage, it revolves around the glorious land, the holy city. It revolves around Jerusalem. So where can we see a clash building between a king of the north and a king of the south, kind of this northern power, the southern power, that revolves around Jerusalem? And it's quite clear that it's this Christian-Muslim clash with a radical Islamist king of the south and a European king of the north. That is building, and so all along we've said that you're going to see Egypt allying with this radical Muslim king of the south. And that is a massive forecast. Like Mr. Fleury was saying this in the 90s, and the Iranians were implicated in the assassination of Anwar Sadat. I think they even named streets in Tehran after the guy that killed this beloved Egyptian president. I mean, it would be like Russia having Lee Harvey Oswald Street in the middle of Moscow. It was quite a provocation, and they were backing the Muslim Brotherhood. This led to massive ruptures between Egypt and Iran. They didn't have any diplomatic, they closed their embassies, no flights, none of these things. The two hated each other for decades. And that's when Mr. Fleury made this forecast. So this is a pretty epic turnaround, but it's a turnaround in some ways we're seeing already. Like, I think it was just a few months ago, you had the first ambassadors or first embassies start to be set up between these two countries. There is already, even under Sisi, a certain amount of rapprochement going on between these two. And perhaps there is a path to these two allying without the necessity for a revolution. Maybe if Egypt just kind of gets really desperate for money and Iran is willing to give it to them. But Iran has had strong links to this Muslim Brotherhood terrorist group that is really the Hamas is the Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, that gives you, I think, a sense of some of the close relationship that Iran has with this group. There's a very strong likelihood that they can come in, work with this group if there's a revolution, and it will change the world. I mean, Mr. Fleury, you mentioned that. I had a few quotes I wanted to bring to you from this King of the South booklet, where he draws attention to the way that it talks about Egypt and then Libya and Ethiopia. And he says the emphasis in Daniel 11, verse 42 to 43 is on Egypt. Then we have Libya and Ethiopia. This shows that Egypt is the big conquest. It is the real power behind Libya and Ethiopia, which suggests that it is going to have a heavy hand in swinging these two nations into the Iranian camp. We need to understand the enormous impact that Egypt working with Iran will have in the Middle East and even globally. This Iran-Egypt axis will change the game in the Middle East, particularly in Libya and Ethiopia. And Mr. Foley goes on to talk about all the billions America has given Egypt, like since the Camp David Accords. And this has been a massive they've got a really well-equipped military. What can Iran do with that? I mean, look at how Gaza has been a thorn in Israel's side. What if instead of Gaza, it's Egypt? Like, this completely fundamentally changes all the basic assumptions about Israel's security, about the idea that they won't have to face a major two-front war where they're facing a nation in the north and a nation in the south, like they had to in things like the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. And then they've got a modern, well-equipped army that's an enemy nation in their southern border. You look at Egyptian opinion polls in Egypt, you bring democracy to Egypt and they're going to war with Israel the next day. Like, that is overwhelmingly popular. So this really is a massive deal for Egypt, for the Middle East, for Iran, for Israel, but for the whole world. The Suez Canal means that Europe will be very directly impacted. The global economy will be very directly impacted. Olive oil, very dramatically impacted. Like, this is something that will reverberate around the world in a huge way. But most importantly, this is something directly prophesied in your Bible. And you can very clearly read those scriptures for yourself. Just read Daniel 11, verses 40 to 43, and you can see, that's that very logical inference that, okay, well, the king of the north conquers the king of the south and Egypt, therefore the king of the south and Egypt are aligned. You can read that for yourself, and then you can watch that happen on the world scene. And you can see, again, this principle that we come back to so much from the Bible that Daniel wrote earlier, that God rules in the kingdom of men. And that's a universe-shaking truth that you can also take away from Daniel 11. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mihailo, for that, I think, really undervalued but critically important story.